Some of us know what it feels like to have everything yet feel completely empty inside. Others understand the weight of being surrounded by people who only see your position, never your heart. Emperor Servus ruled Rome for 20 years, but had never felt a woman's loving touch. At 40, the most powerful man alive was still a virgin. The Senate called him weak. His own guards pitied him. Then one stormy night, a big-hearted widow knocked on his palace door, completely unaware she was speaking to the emperor. She treated him like a regular man who needed warmth and honest conversation. Their meeting would change both their lives forever. But could love born from such an unlikely encounter survive the dangerous world of Roman politics? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The marble bust of Marcus Aurelius watched over Emperor Servus as he began another day in his gilded prison. Dawn light filtered through the tall windows of his private chambers, casting long shadows across the polished floors that had never known a woman's bare feet. The statue's weathered face seemed to mock him with its serene wisdom. Marcus Aurelius had been married, had children, had known the warmth of human connection that Servus could only imagine. At 40 years old, Servus had ruled the Roman Empire for 2 decades. He had conquered territories, negotiated treaties, and commanded the respect of kings and senators alike. Yet every morning began the same way, alone in a bed large enough for 4, staring at the ceiling. Painted with scenes of triumph, he felt too hollow to claim. Helena entered without a knocking, a privilege earned through 20 years of service that began when she was assigned as his personal attendant during his coronation. Now in her 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and kind eyes that had witnessed his transformation from terrified boy to isolated emperor, she was perhaps the only person in the palace who dared to treat him as human rather than deity. "The Senate requests an audience this morning," she said, setting down a tray of bread, honey, and watered wine. "Senator Marcus has been particularly vocal about scheduling another discussion regarding your matrimonial duties." Servus sat up slowly, his dark hair tousled from a restless night. The irony wasn't lost on him that Marcus Aurelius had written extensively about duty and acceptance. Yet here was Servus, struggling with the most basic human duty of all, continuing his bloodline. What excuse does he offer this time? The usual concerns about succession and stability. Helena busied herself selecting his toga, her movements practiced and efficient. He's brought a list of suitable patrician daughters. The youngest is 16. The emperor's jaw tightened. 16. When he was 16, he had been studying philosophy and dreaming of a quiet life as a scholar. Now he was expected to bed a girl younger than his reign. "Tell Senator Marcus that the emperor's personal affairs remain personal. You've been saying that for 5 years." Servus. Helena used his given name when they were alone, another small rebellion that he cherished. The Senate grows restless. They whisper that perhaps the gods have cursed your line, that your condition reflects divine displeasure, his condition, as if virginity were a disease rather than simply the result of 20 years of fear, duty, and the crushing weight of always being watched, always being judged. Every potential bride had been a political alliance, every courtship a performance for the masses. How could he explain that the very act that was supposed to create life felt like another death to him, the death of any remaining privacy, any hope of genuine connection? "The gods have blessed Rome with peace and prosperity under my rule," Servus said, standing to allow Helena to drape the purple-striped toga over his tunic. "Perhaps they care less about my bedroom activities than the Senate assumes." Helena's weathered hands smoothed the fabric with maternal care. "I remember when you were crowned," she said softly, 20 years old and shaking like a leaf during the ceremony. "Do you remember what you whispered to me as they placed the laurel crown on your head?" Servus closed his eyes, remembering that terrifying day when his uncle's sudden death had thrust him from comfortable obscurity into absolute power. "I said I wasn't ready. And I told you that readiness was a luxury emperors couldn't afford." Helena stepped back to assess her work. But perhaps I was wrong. Perhaps some things, some connections, can't be rushed or commanded. The emperor walked to his window, gazing out at the sprawling city below. Rome stretched endlessly in all directions, millions of lives depending on his decisions, yet he felt more isolated than a hermit in the wilderness. Smoke rose from countless chimneys. Couples walked hand in hand through the forums. Children played in the streets, all of it as foreign to his experience as the barbarian territories beyond the Rhine. Captain Lucius appeared in the doorway, his weathered face bearing the scars of campaigns in Germania and Gaul. He had served Servus's uncle and transferred that loyalty seamlessly to the nephew, becoming both protector and the closest thing to a friend the emperor possessed. "Caesar, the Senate awaits." "Of course they do." Servus adjusted his toga and slipped his imperial seal ring onto his finger. The heavy gold band bore the eagle of Rome, wings spread in eternal triumph, a symbol of power that felt increasingly meaningless with each passing year. "Tell me, Lucius, do the men still speak of their emperor behind closed doors?" The captain's uncomfortable silence provided the answer. Lucius had never learned to lie convincingly, a trait that made him trustworthy but occasionally painful. "They worry, Caesar. Not about your leadership, never that, but about the future. But what happens when I die without an heir?" Servus finished the thought that haunted every conversation, every decision, every sleepless night. "Yes, I imagine they do worry." They walked through corridors lined with statues of previous emperors, men who had married, procreated, and secured their legacies. Augustus gazed down with marble eyes that seemed to judge. Trajan's carved features radiated the confidence of a man who had never doubted his place in the world. Even the mad ones, Caligula, Nero, had at least tried to fulfill their dynastic obligations, however unsuccessfully. The Senate chamber buzzed with conversation that died instantly when Servus entered. 56 of Rome's most powerful men rose as one, their faces carefully neutral but their thoughts transparent. Here was their emperor, brilliant, just, effective, and utterly failing in his most fundamental duty. Senator Marcus stood as Servus took his ivory chair. Marcus was a man of medium height with silver hair and the kind of political cunning that made him both valuable and dangerous. He had been angling for influence since Servus's coronation, always positioning himself as the voice of traditional Roman values. "Caesar," Marcus began with practiced deference, "we gather today to address concerns that have grown too pressing to ignore. The empire requires stability, and stability requires succession. The empire has been remarkably stable for 2 decades, Servus replied evenly. Our borders are secure, our treasury full, our citizens prosperous. What precisely requires addressing? Your legacy, Caesar. Marcus gestured to a scroll held by a younger senator. We have compiled a list of suitable brides from the finest patrician families, women of proven fertility and impeccable lineage. The people need to see their emperor embracing the sacred duty of marriage. Servus studied the faces around him. These men had wives, mistresses, children scattered across the empire. They spoke of duty and fertility as if discussing livestock breeding. None of them seemed to understand that the very public nature of imperial marriage had frozen him with terror for 20 years. Marriage is indeed sacred, Servus said carefully. Too sacred to be reduced to political calculation or breeding arrangements. When I marry, it will be to a woman I respect and care for, not to satisfy senatorial schedules. But Caesar, another senator interjected, surely personal preference must bow to imperial necessity. Augustus himself married for the good of Rome. Augustus married for love. Servus cut him off. His marriage to Livia was initially scandalous, but became legendary because it was built on genuine partnership. Would you have me mock that memory with some loveless political charade? The chamber fell silent. Servus had learned that philosophical discussions often ended arguments more effectively than imperial commands. These men were educated. They understood the historical references and the implications. Senator Marcus tried a different approach. Perhaps if Caesar would simply meet some of these young women without commitment. Allow yourself the opportunity to find that connection you speak of. The suggestion hung in the air like incense, sweet but suffocating. Servus imagined the parade of nervous girls, trained from birth to please powerful men, their genuine personalities buried under layers of political instruction and family pressure. How could authentic connection bloom in such artificial soil? "I will consider your counsel," Servus said finally, the diplomatic non-answer that had served him for years. "Are there other matters requiring imperial attention?" The session continued with discussions of grain imports, tax collection, and border defenses, the practical business of empire that Servus handled with competence born from years of experience. But part of his mind remained fixed on the accusation hidden beneath Marcus's words, that his virginity was not just personal failure, but imperial weakness. As the Senate dispersed, Lucius approached. "Well handled, Caesar. You gave them nothing but kept them quiet. For now." Servus walked toward his private study, seeking solitude among his scrolls and correspondence. "But how long can an emperor delay the inevitable?" "They're not wrong about succession, Lucius. If I die tomorrow, Rome falls into chaos. Then perhaps it's time to stop thinking like an emperor and start thinking like a man," Lucius suggested quietly. "The right woman might surprise you. Marriage doesn't have to be the political prison you've imagined." That afternoon, Servus found himself in the palace gardens, a carefully cultivated paradise that felt as artificial as everything else in his life. Marble paths wound between perfectly pruned hedges and precisely placed statuary. Even nature was subject to imperial sea. The storm struck Rome with unusual ferocity that night. Rain lashed against the palace windows like angry spirits demanding entry, while wind howled through the corridors with a voice that seemed almost human. Servus had dismissed his guards early, craving solitude after the day's suffocating Senate session. He sat in his private study, trying to lose himself in Epictetus's writings on acceptance and fate, when the pounding began. At first, he mistook it for thunder, but the rhythm was too deliberate, too insistent. Someone was hammering on the main palace doors with determined fury, each blow echoing through the marble halls like a heartbeat demanding life. "Helena!" he called, but remembered he had sent her to her quarters hours ago. The night guards would be at their posts near the outer walls, following protocol that kept visitors from reaching the emperor's residence after dark. Yet somehow, impossibly, someone had made it through. The pounding continued, accompanied now by a woman's voice, not pleading or deferential, but commanding in a way that made Servus's breath catch. He could not make out her words through the storm and stone, but her tone carried the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. Against every rule of imperial security, Servus found himself walking toward the sound. His bare feet made no noise on the cold marble as he moved through corridors lined with the watchful eyes of painted ancestors. The imperial seal ring felt heavy on his finger as he approached the massive bronze doors that separated his private world from Rome itself. "Open these doors." The woman's voice carried clearly now. "I know someone's in there. I can see the lamplight. This storm will kill me if you leave me out here much longer." Servus pressed his palm against the cold bronze, feeling the vibrations of her continued assault on the other side. No one had ever dared demand entry to the imperial residence. Petitioners waited weeks for audiences, approached through layers of protocol and official channels. Yet this woman, whoever she was, had somehow reached his door and was treating it like any common inn. "Who seeks shelter?" He called through the door, his voice carefully neutral. "A tired widow who's been traveling for 3 days and got caught in this cursed storm," she replied without hesitation. "I'm soaked to the bone and my horse is about to collapse. Have you no charity for a fellow Roman?" The simplicity of her request stunned him. No titles, no flattery, no political maneuvering, just one human being asking another for basic kindness. When had anyone last approached him so directly, so honestly? "The palace guards should have directed you to proper lodgings in the city," Servus said, still uncertain, but drawn by something in her voice he couldn't name. What palace guards? I didn't see any guards, just these enormous doors, and the desperation of getting out of this storm before I drowned standing up. Palace guards. She didn't know where she was. Somehow this woman had wandered through the outer grounds in the storm and found her. Way to his door without realizing. She was seeking shelter from the Emperor of Rome. The impossibility of it made Servus smile for the first time in weeks. He looked down at himself. A simple white tunic, no purple stripes, no imperial regalia. His seal ring caught the lamplight, but in the dark she would never see it. For once in 20 years, he could be just a man answering a door. The bronze locks were massive, designed to keep the world at bay. As Servus lifted the heavy bar, he felt like he was opening more than just a door. He was opening a possibility he had never dared imagine. The door swung inward, and Servus found himself face to face with a woman unlike any he had ever seen. She was large, not just in height but in presence, with curves that spoke of good meals and comfortable living, rather than the skeletal fashions of court ladies. Her dark hair hung in wet tangles around a face that was striking rather than beautiful, with intelligent brown eyes that assessed him without pretense or calculation. Water dripped from every part of her travelling cloak, forming puddles on his pristine marble floor. She was, perhaps 35, with the kind of weathered confidence that came from experience rather than breeding. Her clothes were well made but practical, the garments of a prosperous merchant's wife rather than nobility. "Thank the gods," she said, stepping past him without invitation. "I was beginning to think this place was deserted." She looked around at the opulent entrance hall, taking in the painted ceilings and golden fixtures with curiosity rather than awe. "Quite a place you have here. Are you the steward?" Servus almost laughed. "Steward, a servant, someone with authority but not ultimate power." How long had it been since anyone had made such an assumption about him? "Something like that," he managed. "Good. I'm Claudia Maximilla, recently of Gaul. My husband died 6 months ago, fever, and I'm traveling to my sister's house in Neapolis to start over." She pushed back her wet hair with both hands, unself-conscious in a way that fascinated him. "I can pay for lodging, and I don't eat much despite appearances." The casual reference to her size struck him as remarkable. Court ladies spent fortunes on treatments to achieve the skeletal elegance considered fashionable. Yet this woman seemed comfortable in her own skin in a way that was both foreign and appealing to him. "Payment isn't necessary," Servus said, still marveling at the situation. "But surely you realize this isn't an inn." "Oh, I know it's someone's private home. Quite grand, too." Claudia looked around again, her gaze lingering on the marble statuary. "But I figured anyone rich enough to live like this could afford a little charity. Besides," she grinned, "you look like you could use the company." The observation hit him like a physical blow. Could his loneliness really be so obvious? "What makes you say that?" "The way you answered the door." Most servants would have called for their master, or at least put on more formal clothes, before greeting a stranger. "But you came yourself, as if you were hoping someone might show up." Her brown eyes studied his face with uncomfortable perceptiveness. "When did you last have a real conversation with someone who didn't want something from you?" Servus found himself without an answer. 20 years of imperial dialogue, and he couldn't remember a single exchange that hadn't been colored by political motive or personal agenda. Even Helena, dear as she was, served him in an official capacity that shaped every interaction. "I'm sorry," Claudia said, apparently mistaking his silence for offense. "My late husband always said I was too direct for proper society." "I don't mean to presume." "No," Servus said quickly. "You're not presuming. You're just honest. It's refreshing." Lightning illuminated the entrance hall through the tall windows, followed immediately by thunder that shook the building's foundations. Claudia glanced toward the storm with obvious relief. "Well, honest or not, I'm grateful to be inside." That storm came out of nowhere. One moment clear skies, the next moment I thought the gods themselves were trying to drown me. She untied her traveling cloak and looked around uncertainly. "Is there somewhere I might sit by a fire and perhaps dry out these clothes?" Servus realized he was staring. Here was a woman in his home, the first woman other than Helena to set foot in his private quarters in 2 decades, and she was treating the situation as perfectly natural. No recognition of his status, no performance of deference or seduction, just practical concern for her immediate needs. Of course. "Follow me." He led her toward his private study, the room where he spent most evenings alone with his scrolls and correspondence. The fireplace there was large enough to provide genuine warmth, and the chairs were comfortable rather than ceremonial. As they walked, Claudia's wet sandals squelched against the marble, leaving a trail of water that somehow made the pristine palace feel more human. "Quite a library," she observed, taking in the scrolls and codices that lined the walls. "You must be very educated to work for someone who can afford all this." "I read when I can," Servus replied, stirring the fire to life with an iron poker. The flames cast dancing shadows across the room, creating an intimacy he had never experienced in this space. Claudia settled into the chair across from his usual seat, pulling her wet cloak around herself as steam began to rise from her clothes. "What's your name?" she asked. "I can't keep thinking of you as that kind steward who let me in from the storm." For a moment, Servus considered giving a false name. The temptation to extend this unusual encounter, to experience what it might feel like to be treated as an ordinary man, was overwhelming. But something in her direct gaze demanded honesty. "Servus," he said simply. "Servus." She tested the name as if tasting wine. "It suits you. There's something thoughtful about you, like you carry heavy responsibilities." She smiled, and the expression transformed her entire face. "Though I suppose everyone carries something heavy these days." As the storm raged outside and the fire crackled between them, Servus felt something shifting in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the flames and everything to do with the unprecedented experience of being seen. Really seen by someone who expected nothing from him but honest conversation. They talked until dawn. Servus couldn't remember the last time he had lost track of time so completely, so pleasurably. Claudia possessed the rare gift of easy conversation. She could discuss philosophy with genuine curiosity, share stories from her travels without boasting, and ask questions that revealed real interest rather than polite obligation. "Your master must trust you greatly," she observed as the fire died to glowing embers. "This room feels more like a scholar's study than a servant's quarters." Servus poked at the coals, avoiding her perceptive gaze. Each lie by omission felt heavier than the last, but the truth seemed impossible to speak. How could he explain that he was the emperor without destroying this precious normalcy? "He values learning," he said carefully, "and solitude." "A philosopher-emperor, then?" Claudia's eyes sparkled with amusement. "How wonderfully civilized. Though I imagine it gets lonely, all that thinking and ruling." "Does he have a family?" The question struck deep. "No, no family." "Ah," her expression softened with understanding. "That explains the extensive library and the trusted servants who answer doors in the middle of the night. A lonely man surrounds himself with books and loyal service." She stretched her feet toward the dying warmth. "My husband was similar after we lost our son. Buried himself in his merchant ledgers rather than face the empty rooms." "You had a child." Pain flickered across her features before settling into the kind of acceptance that comes only through survived grief. "Marcus. He would have been 15 this year. Fever took him when he was 7, the same fever that took his father eventually. Some wounds never quite heal, do they? They just become part of who you are." Servus found himself leaning forward, drawn by her willingness to share such intimate sorrow with a stranger. "I'm sorry for your losses, and thank you. It helps to speak of them sometimes. People often act as if mentioning the dead will cause fresh pain, but silence hurts more." She studied his face in the firelight. "You have that look too. The look of someone who carries losses quietly." The observation was so accurate it left him speechless. He did carry losses, the loss of a normal life, of genuine relationships, of the simple human connections that others took for granted. But he had never had words for that particular grief before. "Perhaps we all do at our age," he managed finally. "Perhaps." Claudia pulled her now dry cloak more tightly around her shoulders. Though some people seem better at finding joy, despite their losses, I'm still learning that skill. As pale morning light began filtering through the windows, Servus realized with startling clarity that he didn't want this conversation to end. For the first time in 20 years, he felt understood rather than merely obeyed. Claudia saw him as neither emperor nor failure, but simply as a man worthy of honest discourse. "The storm seems to have passed," she said, following his gaze to the windows where dawn painted the sky in soft pastels. "I should probably continue my journey soon. The roads will be muddy but passable." Panic fluttered in his chest, an emotion so foreign he almost didn't recognize it. "Must you leave immediately? Surely after such a difficult night you could benefit from proper rest." Claudia tilted her head, considering. "Your master wouldn't object to housing a stranger another day?" "I'm certain he would insist upon it." Servus stood, surprising himself with his boldness. "Roman hospitality demands nothing less. Besides, you mentioned traveling for 3 days. You must be exhausted." "I am," she admitted. "And hungry. I haven't had a proper meal since leaving Gaul." The admission sparked an idea that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. "Then allow me to arrange breakfast. There are gardens here that might interest you, and perhaps we could continue our conversation." Her smile was radiant. "I would enjoy that very much, Servus. You're the first person I've met in months who doesn't look at me with pity or calculation. Do you know how refreshing that is?" He knew exactly how refreshing it was, because he was experiencing the same relief. With Claudia, he wasn't a symbol or a problem to be solved. He was simply himself, whatever that might prove to be. After showing her to guest quarters that he prayed she wouldn't recognize as too luxurious for a servant's hospitality, Servus found himself pacing his chambers in a state of nervous energy he hadn't felt since boyhood. Helena appeared at his door, took one look at his expression, and closed the door behind her with unusual care. "You look different this morning," she observed. "We have a guest." Servus tried to sound casual and failed completely. "A traveler caught in the storm. She'll be staying another day." Helena's eyebrows rose. In 20 years of service, she had never seen Servus invite anyone to extend their stay. She? A widow from Gaul. Her name is Claudia. Even saying her name aloud felt significant somehow. She thinks I'm the steward." Understanding dawned in Helena's weathered features, followed by something that might have been hope. "And you didn't correct her?" "How could I?" The moment she knows the truth, everything changes. She'll start performing instead of simply being herself. Servus ran his hands through his hair, disturbing its careful arrangement. "Helena, I talked with her for hours, about philosophy and loss and grief and hope. When did I last have such a conversation?" "Never," Helena said quietly. "Not since your coronation. She treats me like a person worth knowing, not a position to be managed or a problem to be solved. Do you understand what that means to me?" Helena moved closer, her expression gentle. "I do. But you also understand that this deception cannot last indefinitely. What happens when she discovers the truth?" The question that had been haunting him since dawn. "I don't know. Perhaps she'll understand why I needed this. Why I needed to know what it felt like to be seen rather than feared or worshipped or pitied. And if she doesn't understand..." Servus was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the gardens where he hoped to walk with Claudia later. "Then I'll have had one perfect day of being human." "That may have to be enough." Helena studied his face with the sharp attention of someone who had watched him grow from terrified boy to isolated emperor. "You're falling in love with her." The words hung in the air like incense, sweet and slightly dangerous. Servus wanted to deny them, but found he couldn't. Something was certainly happening in his chest, something warm and frightening and completely foreign to his experience. "I barely know her," he protested weakly. "You know how she makes you feel. For a man who has spent 20 years afraid of genuine connection, that's quite significant." Helena moved toward the door, then paused. "I'll arrange breakfast in the garden pavilion. And Servus, don't waste this opportunity by overthinking it. Sometimes the gods give us exactly what we need, even when we're too afraid to ask for it. As Helena left to make the arrangements, Servus found himself standing before the marble bust of Marcus Aurelius again. The philosopher-emperor's carved features seemed less judgmental this morning, perhaps even slightly approving. "What would you do?" he asked the statue silently. "How does a man choose between duty and the first real happiness he's ever known?" But Marcus Aurelius had been married, had known love and fatherhood and the full spectrum of human experience. His philosophical acceptance had been earned through living, not through hiding behind imperial walls. For the first time in his life, Servus understood that his greatest fear wasn't death or political failure, or even the collapse of the empire. His greatest fear was returning to the suffocating loneliness he had accepted as the price of power. Claudia had shown him another way of being, and the thought of losing it felt like contemplating his own execution. The question was no longer whether he was falling in love. The question was whether he had the courage to see where that fall might lead. The garden pavilion had been transformed into something approaching intimacy under Helena's careful direction. Instead of the usual imperial breakfast service with its golden plates and ceremonial abundance, she had arranged a simple meal of bread, honey, fresh fruit, and watered wine on wooden platters that wouldn't immediately betray the wealth of their surroundings. Servus arrived first, his stomach tight with nervous anticipation. He had changed from his sleeping tunic into a simple brown garment that could believably belong to a trusted steward, though he kept his imperial seal ring. Telling himself it was habit rather than the security it provided, when Claudia appeared, walking slowly through the garden paths with obvious appreciation for the carefully tended beauty around her, Servus felt his breath catch. In daylight, washed and rested, she was even more striking than she had seemed by firelight. Her dark hair was braided simply, her traveling dress clean and practical, but she moved with a natural grace that made the elaborate court ladies he knew seem like painted dolls in comparison. "This is extraordinary," she said, settling across from him at the small table. "Your master certainly knows how to live well. These gardens must require dozens of gardeners." "He appreciates beauty," Servus replied, watching her face as she took in the carefully arranged flowers and precisely trimmed hedges. "Though I think he sometimes forgets to enjoy it himself." "Ah, one of those men who creates paradise but forgets to sit in it." Claudia selected a piece of bread and drizzled it with honey. "My husband was similar, always working to build something better for tomorrow instead of appreciating what existed today. I tried to teach him to slow down, but merchants never quite learn that lesson. What would you have taught him if you'd had more time?" The question seemed to surprise her with its earnestness. She chewed thoughtfully, her brown eyes distant with memory. "To notice things. The way morning light falls differently each day. How bread tastes better when you're actually paying attention instead of reading ledgers while you eat. The sound of genuine laughter versus polite social noise. Each observation felt like a revelation to Servus. When had he last noticed morning light except as a signal that another day of imperial duties was beginning? When had he tasted food rather than simply consuming fuel for his obligations? "You make it sound like a form of worship," he said, "isn't it? We're given these brief lives, these temporary bodies, these fleeting moments of connection with other people. Seems foolish not to pay attention." She smiled, and again he was struck by how the expression transformed her entire face. "Though I suppose that's easy to say when you don't carry the weight of real responsibility. Your master, for instance. An emperor must have little time for contemplating bread and morning light." The irony was so sharp it was almost painful. Here she was, unknowingly teaching the emperor himself how to appreciate the life he had been living without truly experiencing. Perhaps emperors need such reminders more than most people. Perhaps they do. All that power, all those decisions affecting millions of lives. It must be terrifying to realize you're just as human and fallible as everyone else. Claudia reached for her wine cup, her movements unselfconscious and natural. "I often wondered if Alexander or Caesar ever just wanted to be ordinary men, to walk through markets without guards, to have conversations that weren't about conquests or politics. What do you think? Servus found himself leaning forward, genuinely curious about her perspective on the very life he lived. I think they were probably desperately lonely, all those people around them, but no one who could see past the purple stripes and golden wreaths to the frightened human being underneath. Her expression grew thoughtful. Power like that must be a kind of prison. Everyone wants something from you. Everyone fears you or worships you, but nobody simply enjoys your company for who you are. The accuracy of her observation left Servus momentarily speechless. She had described his existence with more precision than his closest advisors, and she didn't even know she was doing it. You seem to have given this considerable thought, he managed. I've had time to think, traveling alone. And I suppose losing Marcus and my son made me reflect on what actually matters in life. It's not the grand gestures or public achievements. It's the quiet moments of genuine connection. The conversations that help you understand yourself better. The feeling of being truly seen by another person. She paused, looking slightly embarrassed. Listen to me, philosophizing like some wise woman when I'm just a widow with too much time to think. Don't apologize, Servus said quickly. You're not philosophizing. You're speaking truth. It's just that most people are too afraid or too busy to acknowledge it. Their eyes met across the table, and something passed between them. A recognition of shared understanding that felt more intimate than any physical touch Servus had ever imagined. Here was someone who could see him, really see him, without the distorting lens of imperial worship or political calculation. Tell me about your travels, he said, desperate to keep her talking, to keep this precious normalcy flowing between them. What have you seen on your journey to Neapolis? Claudia's face brightened, and she launched into stories of small towns and roadside encounters, of merchant families who had shared their meals and innkeepers who had offered advice about everything from horse care to heartbreak. She spoke with genuine affection for the ordinary people she had met, seeing dignity and wisdom in blacksmiths and bakers that Servus had been trained to regard as subjects rather than individuals. There was one old woman in a village outside Ravenna, Claudia said, her eyes sparkling with remembered delight. She must have been 80, but she invited me to share her fire and her bread without knowing anything about me, except that I was alone and tired. We spent the evening comparing remedies for grief. She had lost 3 sons in various wars, and by morning I felt more hopeful about life than I had in months. What did she tell you? That grief changes but never disappears, and that's as it should be. Love that matters leaves permanent marks. But she also said that choosing to remain bitter is like choosing to stay buried with the dead, instead of honoring them by continuing to live fully. Claudia's voice grew soft. She said the best memorial we can offer to those we've lost is to keep our hearts open to new love, new friendship, new possibilities. The words hit Servus with unexpected force. He had been living as if his emotional isolation was a form of imperial discipline. But perhaps it was actually a kind of cowardice, a way of avoiding the risk that came with genuine human connection. Wise advice, he said quietly. Yes, though easier to understand than to follow. Claudia studied his face with growing concern. You look sad suddenly. Have I said something wrong? No, you've said something right. That's what makes it difficult. She reached across the table without thinking, covering his hand with her own. The touch was warm, calloused from years of practical work, utterly without pretense or calculation. Servus felt his entire world shift in that moment. This simple contact contained more authentic intimacy than 20 years of imperial ceremony and political maneuvering. Sometimes the right things are the most frightening, she said softly, but that usually means they're worth pursuing. Looking down at her hand covering his, Servus realized that his greatest fear was no longer discovery or political consequences. His greatest fear was that this woman would eventually leave, taking with her the first real happiness he had ever known, and he would return to being not the Emperor of Rome, but simply the loneliest man in the world. The afternoon brought unexpected complications. Captain Lucius approached the garden pavilion with the measured stride of a man bearing unwelcome news. His scarred face carefully neutral as he took in the unprecedented sight of his emperor sharing an intimate meal with a woman. "Caesar," he began, then caught himself as Claudia looked up with curiosity. "Forgive me, I meant to say, the master requires your attention on urgent matters." Servus felt heat rise in his cheeks. Lucius had nearly destroyed everything with that single word, Caesar. But Claudia seemed to interpret the near slip differently. "Ah, you must be the captain of the household guards," she said warmly, rising from her chair with the natural courtesy that had charmed Servus from their first meeting. "I'm Claudia Maximilla. Your steward here has been wonderfully hospitable to a storm-stranded traveller." Lucius glanced between them, his weathered features betraying nothing of his confusion at this reversal of roles. 20 years of military discipline allowed him to adapt quickly to unexpected situations. "Welcome to our household, madam. The master is generous with his hospitality." "Indeed he is, though I've yet to meet him personally. Servus tells me he's something of a scholar and philosopher." Claudia smiled at the captain with the same genuine warmth she had shown everyone. "You must have interesting work, protecting such a learned man." "Very interesting," Lucius replied carefully. "If you'll excuse us, madam, duty calls." As they walked toward the palace, Lucius kept his voice low but urgent. "Caesar, what in the name of all gods are you doing? Senator Marcus has been asking questions about your absence from this morning's scheduled meetings. And now I find you playing house with some provincial widow who thinks you're a servant." "Keep your voice down," Servus hissed, glancing back to ensure Claudia was out of earshot. "And she's not some provincial widow. She's the first person in 20 years to treat me like a human being rather than an imperial symbol. She treats you like a human being because she doesn't know who you are." Lucius grabbed his arm, forcing him to stop. "What happens when she discovers the truth? Have you considered that this woman might be a spy, an assassin, a political operative sent to compromise you?" The suggestion struck Servus as absurd. "Did you see her last night, soaked and desperate in the storm? Listen to her speak about grief and loss and the simple joys of being alive. She's no more a spy than you are. Even if that's true, and you're gambling the Empire's stability on your judgment of a woman you've known for less than a day, this deception cannot continue. The Senate expects you at tomorrow's session. There are provincial reports requiring your attention, and 3 ambassadors from Germania are arriving by week's end." Reality crashed over Servus like cold water. The Empire continued its relentless demands, regardless of his personal discoveries. Millions of people depended on his decisions, his presence, his careful attention to the endless details of governance. He could not simply disappear into private happiness while Rome waited. "I know," he said quietly. "I know all of that. But Lucius, for the first time in my adult life, I understand what I've been missing. She makes me want to be better than just an effective administrator of other people's lives." "And what of your duty? What of the succession question that grows more pressing each day?" Senator Marcus isn't wrong about the Empire's need for stability. Before Servus could respond, Helena appeared in the corridor, her expression troubled. "Caesar, forgive the interruption, but there's been a development. Your guest has been asking questions about the household, innocent curiosity, but she's beginning to notice inconsistencies." Servus felt his stomach tighten. "What kind of questions? Why a steward would have access to such extensive libraries? Why the other servants seem to defer to you with unusual formality? Why no one has mentioned the master's name or when he might return?" Helena wrung her hands, a gesture of anxiety he had rarely seen from her. "She's intelligent, Servus. She's starting to piece together that something isn't as it seems." The walls of his deception were crumbling faster than he had anticipated. Each moment of genuine connection with Claudia had been built on a foundation of lies, and now those lies were threatening to destroy the very thing he had hoped to protect. "There's more," Helena continued reluctantly. "Senator Marcus has sent word that he expects a private audience this evening regarding matters of imperial urgency. He's also requested a guest list of everyone currently residing in the palace. The political implications were clear. If Marcus discovered that the emperor was secretly harboring a woman in his private quarters, especially while avoiding senatorial duties, it would provide ammunition for every argument about Servus's unfitness for rule. The gossip alone could damage his authority irreparably. "What do you recommend?" Servus asked, though he dreaded the answer. Lucius and Helena exchanged glances before the captain spoke. "End it now before it becomes a scandal that threatens the empire. Arrange safe passage for the woman to continue her journey. Compensate her generously for any inconvenience and return to your duties. This was a pleasant interlude, but it cannot continue." The practical advice felt like a physical blow. End it now. Return to the suffocating isolation of imperial duty. Pretend that these few hours of authentic human connection had never happened. And if I refuse, then you risk everything you've spent 20 years building, Helena said gently. Your reputation, your authority, the stability of Rome itself. Is one woman worth that gamble? The question hung in the air like incense, sweet but poisonous. Was Claudia worth risking the empire? Was his personal happiness worth potentially destroying the lives of millions who depended on Roman stability? But even as he considered the rational arguments, Servus found himself thinking of Claudia's hand covering his at breakfast, her genuine laughter echoing through the garden pavilion, her insight about the loneliness of power. For 40 years, he had sacrificed everything personal for imperial duty, and what had it gained him? A stable empire ruled by a man slowly dying of emotional starvation. Give me until tomorrow evening, he said finally. Let me attend Marcus's audience, handle the immediate crises, and then decide how to proceed. Caesar, Lucius began. Until tomorrow evening, Servus repeated with imperial finality. That's my decision. As his advisors reluctantly agreed and departed to manage the day's crises, Servus stood alone in the corridor, torn between the life he had always known and the possibility of something entirely different. Through the window he could see Claudia walking in the gardens, her figure solid and real against the carefully manicured landscape. She represented everything he had never dared to want: authentic connection, honest conversation, the simple joy of being known and accepted for who he was rather than what he represented. But she also represented the greatest risk he had ever contemplated, the possibility that love might matter more than duty, that personal happiness might be worth gambling an empire. Tomorrow, he would have to choose between the emperor Rome needed and the man he was only now discovering he could be. Tonight, he would pretend that such a choice might somehow not destroy him, regardless of what he decided. The weight of his imperial seal ring had never felt heavier on his finger, a golden reminder that some burdens, once accepted, could never truly be set aside. Evening brought Senator Marcus to the palace with the punctuality of a man accustomed to having his demands met immediately. A service received him in the formal audience chamber, surrounded by the full regalia of imperial power that felt increasingly like armor, protective but suffocating. Marcus entered with his usual confident stride, but his shrewd eyes took in details that made Servus's skin crawl with apprehension. The senator had built his political career on noticing inconsistencies and exploiting weaknesses, skills that had served Rome well in negotiations with barbarian tribes, but felt threatening when directed at the emperor himself, Caesar. Marcus began with ceremonial deference that barely concealed his impatience. Your absence from this morning's scheduled audiences has caused considerable concern among the Senate. I was attending to personal matters, Servus replied, settling into his ivory chair with practiced imperial composure. Surely the empire can survive a few hours without senatorial debate about my marriage prospects, personal matters. Marcus's eyebrows rose with polite incredulity. Forgive my curiosity, Caesar, but your personal matters have historically been quite limited. Has something changed? The question was casual enough on the surface, but Servus heard the underlying investigation. Marcus suspected something, though hopefully not the full truth. A man occasionally requires solitude for reflection, Senator. Even emperors need time to think without the constant pressure of political obligations. Of course, Caesar. Though I confess the household staff mentioned an unexpected guest, a traveler seeking shelter from the storm. Roman hospitality is admirable, but surely such visitors are usually directed to appropriate lodgings in the city rather than the emperor's personal residence. Servus felt ice form in his stomach. Marcus knew about Claudia. The question was how much he knew and what he intended to do with the information. The storm was particularly severe, Servus said carefully. Christian charity demanded immediate shelter rather than sending a fellow Roman back into dangerous weather. Ah, yes, Christian charity. Marcus's smile was thin and calculating. Though I'm told this particular Roman is a woman, a widow from Gaul, traveling alone. Quite unusual for a respectable woman to be wandering the countryside without proper escort, don't you think? Unusual circumstances often require unusual responses, Senator. Are you suggesting that the Emperor's compassion for a storm-stranded traveler somehow compromises imperial dignity? Not at all, Caesar. I merely observe that your compassion has extended to providing this woman with guest quarters and personal attention that some might interpret as exceeding the bounds of simple hospitality. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Marcus was building a case that could be used to question Servus's judgment, his fitness for rule, his adherence to the moral standards expected of Rome's leader. A sexually inexperienced emperor secretly entertaining a woman in his private quarters would provide ammunition for every political enemy in the Senate. Senator Marcus, Servus said with all the imperial authority he could muster, "Are you questioning my conduct?" "I question nothing, Caesar. I merely express concern for your welfare and that of the empire. An unmarried emperor approaching middle age might be vulnerable to influences that more experienced men would resist. A clever woman might recognize such vulnerability and exploit it for personal gain." The implication struck Servus like a physical blow. Marcus was suggesting that Claudia was a seductress, a manipulator preying on imperial loneliness for her own advancement. The characterization was so far from the honest, grieving widow he had come to know that it felt like blasphemy. "Your concern is noted," Servus said through gritted teeth, "but unnecessary. I'm perfectly capable of managing my own affairs. Of course, Caesar. Though perhaps this situation presents an opportunity rather than a threat." Marcus leaned forward slightly, his political instincts detecting an opening. A mature widow, presumably experienced in wifely duties, might provide practical education for an emperor who has delayed marriage for philosophical reasons. If she proves satisfactory in private matters, she could even serve as preparation for eventual marriage to a more suitable bride. The casual crudeness of the suggestion made Servus want to reach for his sword. Marcus was proposing that Claudia be used as a sexual instructor, a temporary convenience to prepare the emperor for eventual political marriage. The reduction of her dignity, her genuine warmth and intelligence, to such base calculation filled him with rage he hadn't felt since his coronation. "Senator," Servus said with dangerous quiet, "you will not speak of this matter again to me or to anyone else. Are we clear?" Marcus recognized the warning in the emperor's tone, but pressed forward with the persistence that made him politically effective and personally insufferable. "Caesar, I speak only out of concern for Rome's future. An emperor who remains unmarried and childless, approaches 41 years of age, creates instability that our enemies notice and exploit. If this woman can help you overcome whatever hesitations have prevented you from fulfilling your dynastic obligations, perhaps the Senate should be grateful rather than concerned. The Senate's gratitude is not required for my private decisions. But Caesar, private decisions become public concerns when they affect imperial succession. Surely you understand that your personal life is not truly personal. It belongs to Rome, just as your life belongs to Rome. Marcus's voice took on the earnest tone he used when delivering what he considered profound truths. An emperor has no purely private existence. Every choice, every relationship, every intimate moment serves the empire's needs. The words hit Servus with the force of absolute recognition. Marcus was right. Emperors had no private lives, no personal happiness that wasn't subject to political calculation and public utility. Every relationship was a tool of statecraft, every emotion a potential weapon for enemies to exploit. But even as he acknowledged the truth of Marcus's observation, Servus found himself thinking of Claudia's hand covering his at breakfast. Her genuine concern for his loneliness, her insight about the simple joys that made life worth living. For the first time in 20 years, he had experienced what it meant to be valued for who he was, rather than what he could provide. "Your point is noted, Senator," Servus said finally. Now, was there other business requiring imperial attention? Marcus recognized the dismissal, but couldn't resist one final thrust. "Only this, Caesar. Whatever temporary education this woman might provide, remember that Rome requires a legitimate heir from your body. Personal pleasure is admirable, but dynastic duty is essential. Don't allow momentary satisfaction to blind you to permanent obligations." After Marcus departed, Servus remained in the audience chamber for a long time, staring at the painted ceiling that depicted scenes of imperial triumph. Conquests, treaties, the submission of barbarian tribes, all the external achievements that meant nothing if the man who accomplished them died hollow and alone. The choice before him was becoming clearer and more painful with each passing hour. He could end his deception, reveal his identity to Claudia, and attempt to transform their genuine connection into something that served imperial needs. Marriage, children, political stability. But such revelation would inevitably change everything between them, turning spontaneous affection into calculated alliance, or he could continue the deception, stealing whatever brief happiness was possible before duty inevitably reclaimed him, knowing that every moment of authentic connection was built on lies that would eventually destroy it. Neither option offered the simple human love he had discovered was possible. Neither path led to the kind of relationship Claudia herself had described. Two people, seeing each other clearly, accepting each other honestly, choosing each other freely without political calculation or imperial obligation. As night deepened around the palace, Servus realized that his greatest enemy was not Senator Marcus or political intrigue, or even his own inexperience with love. His greatest enemy was the purple stripe on his toga, the golden crown in his chambers, the imperial seal ring that marked him as belonging not to himself, but to Rome. He was falling in love with a woman who could never love him back, not because she was unwilling, but because the man she was learning to care for didn't truly exist outside these stolen moments of deception. The morning of the third day brought an end to pretense in the most unexpected way. Servus found Claudia in the library, not browsing the scrolls as he had hoped, but seated at his private writing desk with several documents spread before her. Her face was pale, her hands trembling slightly as she held a piece of correspondence bearing the unmistakable imperial seal. She looked up as he entered, and in her brown eyes he saw not anger, but a deep, wounded confusion that cut him more deeply than rage would have. "Your name isn't really Servus, is it?" she said quietly. The moment he had dreaded and anticipated had arrived with brutal suddenness. Standing in the doorway of his own library, watching the woman he had fallen in love with discover his deception, Servus felt the last illusion of normalcy crumble around him. "No," he said simply. "It isn't." Claudia gestured to the documents before her, letters from provincial governors, military reports, correspondence that could only belong to one man in the empire. "These are addressed to Emperor Servus Aurelius Maximus. That would be you, I presume?" "Yes," she was quiet for a long moment, her gaze moving from the official documents to his face, as if trying to reconcile the man she had shared intimate conversations with and the most powerful ruler in the known world. 3 days, she said finally. 3 days I've been staying in the palace of the Roman Emperor, thinking I was the guest of some wealthy scholar's steward. 3 days of honest conversation with a man who was lying to me about the most fundamental fact of his existence. The pain in her voice was worse than any senatorial condemnation he had ever faced. Claudia, don't. She stood abruptly, the imperial correspondence scattering across the desk. Don't say my name as if we're still friends, as if this deception doesn't change everything between us. It doesn't have to change everything. Her laugh was bitter and heartbreaking. And doesn't it? You're the Emperor of Rome, and I'm a provincial widow who's been making casual observations about imperial loneliness while talking to the Emperor himself. Do you have any idea how foolish I feel? How humiliated. You have no reason to feel foolish. Everything you said was true. Everything I said was patronizing nonsense. Claudia's composure finally cracked, revealing the full depth of her hurt and anger. I sat there explaining to you how lonely emperors must be, how they probably just want to be treated like ordinary men, while you were performing exactly the charade I was describing. Was it amusing? Did you enjoy watching me unknowingly analyze your own life back to you? The accusation stung because it contained a grain of truth. There had been moments when her insights about imperial isolation had felt like looking in a mirror, moments when he had marveled at her understanding of experiences she supposedly couldn't fathom. It wasn't amusement, Servus said desperately. It was relief. For the first time in 20 years, someone was seeing me clearly, understanding what this life actually costs. Seeing you? Clearly? Claudia's voice rose with incredulous anger. I wasn't seeing you at all. I was seeing a performance, a lie you constructed to amuse yourself at my expense. The man I thought I was getting to know doesn't exist. He does exist. The conversations we shared, the connection between us, that was real, built on deception. She moved toward the window, putting physical distance between them as if proximity to him was painful. You let me share my grief about my husband and son with a stranger. Let me speak about loneliness and loss and the simple joys of human connection, all while knowing that you were making a fool of me. I never intended— What did you intend? Claudia whirled to face him, her cheeks flushed with anger and unshed tears. A few days of entertainment with a gullible provincial? A chance to play at being normal before returning to your imperial duties? Or perhaps this was some elaborate test to see if I was worthy of imperial attention. Each suggestion was worse than the last, and all of them missed the truth entirely. But how could he explain that her arrival had saved him from a despair he hadn't even recognized? How could he make her understand that these 3 days had been the most honest of his adult life, even built on the foundation of lies? I intended to know what it felt like to be seen as a man rather than an emperor, he said quietly. I intended to have one real conversation before returning to a life of political theater and ceremonial isolation. I never intended to fall in love with you. The words hung in the air between them, like a confession and an accusation. Claudia's anger flickered, replaced momentarily by something that might have been hope before hardening into skepticism. Love? She said. You don't even know me. You know a widow who was foolish enough to share her honest thoughts with someone she trusted. But I don't know you at all, do I? I know some character you were playing, some role you performed for your own amusement. You know me better than anyone has in 20 years, Servus insisted, taking a step toward her. The man who talked with you about philosophy and loss, who listened to your stories of travel and grief, that was me. Not the emperor, not a performance, but the man I might have been if fate had chosen differently. But fate didn't choose differently. Claudia's voice grew quiet, sadder than angry now. You are the emperor. You have responsibilities, obligations, a role to play that's larger than personal desires. And I'm a nobody from Gaul who stumbled into something far beyond my understanding. You're not a nobody. To you, I am. I have to be. She moved back to the desk, gathering the scattered documents with shaking hands. Look at these letters, these reports. The entire empire depends on your attention, your decisions. You can't afford to be distracted by personal feelings for some accidental house guest. What if I choose to be distracted? The question surprised them both. Servus hadn't planned to say it, but once spoken, it felt like the most important words he had ever uttered. Claudia stopped shuffling papers and looked at him with something approaching pity. You can't choose that. You're the emperor. Your life belongs to Rome, not to yourself. That's what power costs, the right to make purely personal choices. But what if I'm willing to pay a different price? What if I choose love over duty? Then you'd be betraying millions of people who depend on you. Her voice was gentle now, but implacable. And you'd be asking me to be the woman who convinced the emperor of Rome to abandon his responsibilities. That's not love, Servus, that's selfishness. The use of his name, his real name in that context, felt like a knife between his ribs. She understood exactly who he was and what he was asking of her, and she was refusing not out of anger, but out of wisdom. So what happens now? He asked. Claudia finished gathering the documents and placed them carefully on the desk. Now I continue my journey to Neapolis, and you return to being the emperor Rome needs. We pretend these 3 days never happened. I can't pretend that. Then you learn to live with the memory while fulfilling your duties. She moved toward the door, then paused without turning around. For what it's worth, I think I could have loved you too. The man you showed me, the lonely scholar who answered doors in storms and shared honest conversation. But that man is a luxury the emperor can't afford. As she left the library, Servus remained standing among his scrolls and correspondence, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of centuries and feeling more ignorant than he ever had in his life. He had finally found love, authentic connection, the possibility of genuine happiness, and it was being taken away not by external forces, but by the very power that was supposed to give him everything he desired. The imperial seal ring felt heavier than ever on his finger, a golden shackle that bound him to a throne, but severed him from his own humanity. Outside the window, Rome sprawled endlessly under the morning sun, millions of lives depending on his wisdom and sacrifice. But for the first time in his reign, Servus wondered if an empire built on one man's complete emotional starvation was truly worth preserving. The hours following Claudia's discovery passed in a blur of imperial obligations that felt more suffocating than ever before. Servus met with provincial governors, reviewed military dispatches, and presided over a Senate session discussing grain, imports from Egypt, all while feeling as though he were performing the role of emperor. Rather than actually being one, every interaction felt hollow. After the authentic connection he had briefly known, Senator Marcus's self-satisfied smirk during discussions of imperial marriage arrangements made Servus want to reveal everything just to see the shock on the man's calculating face. But such revelation would only confirm Marcus's suspicions and provide ammunition for future political attacks. Helena appeared in his chambers as evening approached, her weathered features creased with concern. "She's preparing to leave at first light," she said without preamble. "Her traveling pack is ready, and she's asked for directions to the quickest route to Neapolis." Servus continued staring out his window at the city below, where thousands of oil lamps were beginning to flicker to life as darkness fell. Good, that's what should happen, is it? Helena settled into the chair across from his desk, another small rebellion that he had always treasured, but which now felt like mockery of real intimacy. "You've barely spoken to anyone today, except in official capacity. You look like a man attending his own funeral." "Perhaps I am." Servus finally turned from the window, and Helena drew in a sharp breath at his expression. "The man I was becoming over the past 3 days, the man who could laugh at honest stories and share genuine conversation, that man is dead. What's left is the emperor, and emperors don't get to choose love over duty." Says who? The question was simple, but it hit him with unexpected force. Says everyone. Says tradition, says political necessity, says the basic structure of imperial power, says Senator Marcus and his ilk, you mean. Helena's voice carried a rare edge of anger. Men who have never carried the weight you carry, never sacrificed what you've sacrificed, telling you that further sacrifice is your only option. They're not wrong, though. An emperor's life belongs to Rome. An emperor's life belongs to the emperor first, Helena interrupted with startling firmness. Rome benefits from having a ruler who understands joy, who has experienced genuine human connection, who knows what he's actually protecting when he makes decisions about war and peace and the welfare of his people. Servus looked at her with surprise. In 20 years of service, Helena had never challenged imperial philosophy so directly. You think I should what? Abandon my duties? Abdicate? Run off with a woman I've known for 3 days? I think you should consider that there might be options beyond complete abdication or complete renunciation of personal happiness. Helena leaned forward, her eyes bright with the intensity of someone who had clearly been thinking deeply about this problem. What if you told her the truth about why you deceived her? What if you asked her to consider staying, not as some secret mistress, but as your empress? The suggestion was so audacious it left Servus momentarily speechless. Mary Claudia? A provincial widow with no political connections, no dowry that strengthens imperial alliances? The Senate would revolt. Let them. You're not asking their permission. You're informing them of your decision. Helena's smile was fierce. Besides, what could they actually do? Depose the most effective emperor in 3 generations because he married for love instead of political convenience. They could make governance impossible, refuse to pass legislation, withhold provincial cooperation, encourage military commanders to question imperial authority, or they could adapt, as politicians always do when presented with fait accompli. Helena stood and moved to his wine table, pouring 2 cups with the familiarity of decades. Servus, you've spent 20 years proving your competence, your dedication, your wisdom. You've earned the right to make one choice based on personal happiness rather than political calculation. Taking the wine cup from her felt like accepting communion, a ritual acknowledgement of possibilities he barely dared consider. But what about succession? The dynastic concerns that Marcus raises constantly. Marry her. Have children if the gods will it. If not, adopt an heir as emperors have done before. Helena sat back down, her expression growing gentler. You're 40 years old, not 80. There's time for love and legacy both if you're brave enough to reach for them. Brave enough. Servus tasted the wine, good vintage, but it might as well have been vinegar for all the pleasure he could take in it. Falling in love is terrifying enough. Proposing marriage to a woman who's seen through my deception and found me wanting, that's beyond courage into madness. Has she found you wanting? Or has she found the situation impossible? Helena's question carried the weight of her years observing human nature. There's a difference between rejecting you and rejecting the complications that come with loving you. The distinction mattered more than Servus wanted to admit. Claudia's anger that morning had been directed at his deception, at the impossible position he had placed her in. But her pain had suggested that the feelings between them were real. Even if the foundation was flawed, what would I even say to her? Forgive me for lying about being the most powerful man in the world. And by the way, would you like to marry me and become Empress of Rome? You might start with the truth about why you lied. Helena's voice grew soft with maternal wisdom. Tell her about 20 years of isolation, about never being seen as a person rather than a position. Tell her that 3 days of genuine human connection meant more to you than 2 decades of imperial worship. And if she refuses, if she can't forgive the deception, or can't accept the complications that come with imperial marriage, then at least you'll know you tried, that you chose to risk rejection rather than guarantee loneliness. Helena finished her wine and stood to leave. But Servus, if you let her leave tomorrow without telling her how you truly feel, without offering her the choice of sharing your life, you'll spend the rest of your reign wondering what might have been. After Helena departed, Servus found himself pacing his chambers like a caged animal. The decision before him felt larger than any military campaign or political crisis he had ever faced. Armies could be defeated, senators could be outmaneuvered. But matters of the heart offered no clear strategy for victory. He thought of Claudia's insight about emperors and loneliness, her casual wisdom about appreciating life's simple pleasures, the warmth of her hand covering his during their breakfast in the garden. He thought of her pain that morning, her mature understanding of the impossible position they both occupied, her refusal to let him abandon duty for personal desire. But he also thought of Marcus's crude suggestions about using women for imperial education, of the endless procession of young patrician brides being prepared for political marriage, of a future stretching endlessly ahead, filled with ceremonial connections and calculated relationships. The imperial seal ring caught lamplight as he moved, its golden surface reflecting the flames in patterns that seemed to mock his indecision. This ring had been both symbol and prison for 20 years, marking him as belonging to Rome rather than to himself. But perhaps Helena was right. Perhaps he had earned the right to one choice based on love rather than duty. Near midnight, he made his decision, moving quietly through the palace corridors. Servus made his way to the guest quarters where Claudia was staying. Light showed beneath her door, suggesting she was as unable to sleep as he was. He stood outside for several minutes, gathering courage for what might be the most important conversation of his life. When he finally knocked, her voice came immediately. "Come in." She was sitting by the window, still fully dressed, gazing out at the city lights below. Her traveling pack sat ready by the door, a practical reminder of her intention to leave at dawn. She didn't turn when he entered, but her voice carried resigned acknowledgement. "I wondered if you might come," she said quietly. "Though I'm not sure what's left to say." "Everything," Servus replied, closing the door behind him. "Everything I should have said from the beginning." Claudia finally turned to look at him, and in the lamplight he could see that she had been crying. The evidence of her pain struck him like a physical blow. He had caused these tears, these sleepless hours, this wounded confusion. "I'm listening," she said simply, standing in her doorway, looking at this woman who had transformed his understanding of what life could offer. Servus realized that the next few minutes would determine not just his personal future, but the kind of emperor he would become. The choice was no longer between love and duty. It was between the courage to reach for both and the cowardice of accepting neither. "Let me tell you, about 20 years of wishing I was someone else," he began, and saw something shift in her expression that might have been hope. Servus moved deeper into the room, his hands trembling slightly as he began the most important speech of his life. Claudia remained by the window, her face carefully neutral, but her eyes alert with cautious attention. "When I was 20 years old," he began, "my uncle died suddenly of a fever, and I went from being a philosophy student to being Emperor of Rome in the span of a single day. I wasn't prepared, wasn't trained, wasn't suited for the weight of absolute power. But duty demanded that I accept the purple, so I did." He paused, studying her face for any sign of softening, but Claudia's expression remained guarded. "From that moment, I ceased to exist as a person. Every conversation became performance. Every relationship became political calculation. People feared me or worshipped me or wanted to use me, but nobody simply enjoyed my company." His voice grew quieter, more vulnerable. 20 years, Claudia. 20 years without a single genuine human connection. So you decided to play pretend with the first woman, foolish enough to stumble into your palace. The question held less anger than before, but the hurt remained sharp. "No." Servus moved closer, close enough to see the gold flecks in her brown eyes. "I decided to grab hold of the first real conversation I'd had since my coronation and hold on to it as long as possible. I told you my name was Servus because that's who I felt like when I was with you. Not an emperor, just a man grateful for honest company." Claudia's composure flickered. "But you knew I was making a fool of myself, pontificating about imperial loneliness to the emperor himself. You weren't making a fool of yourself. You were seeing me more clearly than anyone ever has." Servus reached toward her, then stopped, his hand hanging in the air between them. Every insight you shared about the isolation of power, every observation about what emperors probably wanted. You were describing my exact experience. It wasn't foolishness, it was wisdom. Wisdom based on false premises, based on true understanding. Servus let his hand fall, but held her gaze. The man who answered your door that night, who shared breakfast with you in the garden, who listened to your stories about grief and hope. That man was real, not the emperor performing for political advantage, just Servus, grateful to be seen as human. For the first time since his arrival, something shifted in Claudia's expression. The anger was still there, but uncertainty had crept in alongside it. "What are you asking of me?" she said quietly. "I'm asking you to forgive me for lying about my identity. I'm asking you to understand that the connection between us was genuine, even built on deception." Servus took a deep breath, gathering courage for words that could change everything. "And I'm asking you to consider staying. Staying as what? Your secret mistress? Some hidden comfort for an emperor too afraid to face real relationships?" "No." The word came out sharper than he intended. "Staying as my wife, as my empress, as my equal partner in this impossible life I've been living alone." The silence that followed was so complete that Servus could hear his own heartbeat. Claudia stared at him with an expression of absolute shock, as if he had just suggested they fly to the moon together. "Your empress," she repeated slowly. "You want to marry me. I want to marry you. I want to wake up every morning knowing that someone sees me as a man worth loving, rather than a position worth fearing. I want to share the burdens of rule with someone who understands both duty and compassion. I want to build a life with you." Claudia moved away from the window, beginning to pace the small room with agitated energy. "You can't marry me. I'm a provincial nobody with no political connections, no royal bloodline, no useful alliances to offer. The Senate would revolt. Let them. I've spent 20 years proving my competence. I've earned the right to make one choice based on love rather than political convenience. But what about succession? What about the stability Marcus is always harping about? We'll have children if the gods will it. If not, we'll adopt an heir. Romans have done both for centuries." Servus moved to intercept her pacing, forcing her to face him. "Claudia, the empire will survive having an empress chosen for love rather than political alliance. What won't survive is me returning to the suffocating isolation that was killing me before you arrived. You barely know me. I know that you see dignity in ordinary people that I was trained to regard as subjects. I know that you've survived profound loss without becoming bitter. I know that you can speak truth about loneliness and grief and hope in ways that help others feel less alone." His voice grew urgent. "I know that 3 days with you taught me more about being human than 20 years of imperial education." Claudia stopped pacing and looked at him with something that might have been wonder. "You're serious? You actually want to marry me? More than I've ever wanted anything, even if it causes political upheaval. Even if the Senate opposes it? Even if it complicates everything about your rule?" Servus thought of Helena's words about earning the right to one choice based on personal happiness. He thought of Marcus's crude calculations and the endless parade of political brides. He thought of 20 more years of ceremonial isolation versus the possibility of sharing his life with someone who saw him clearly. "Especially then," he said firmly. "Claudia, I'm offering you a choice I've never had, the chance to build something real in the middle of all this imperial theater. Will you at least consider it?" Claudia sat heavily on the room's single chair, her hands covering her face as she processed the magnitude of what Servus was proposing. When she finally looked up, her expression was a mixture of wonder, fear, and something that might have been hope. "Do you have any idea what you're asking of me?" she said quietly. "To go from provincial widow to Empress of Rome. To have every word, every gesture, every choice scrutinized by senators and citizens and historians. To carry the weight of imperial expectations when I can barely manage my own grief. I'm asking you to carry that weight with me, instead of letting me bear it alone." Servus knelt beside her chair, bringing himself to her eye level. "Claudia, You've already shown more wisdom about leadership and human nature in 3 days than most court advisors manage in years. You understand what power costs because you've paid prices of your own. But I don't know anything about politics, about diplomacy, about the thousands of details that go into ruling an empire. Neither did I when I was thrust into this role. We learn together, we make mistakes together, we figure out how to be better than the sum of our fears. His hands found hers, and she didn't pull away. You told me once that the best memorial we can offer to those we've lost is to keep our hearts open to new love. What if this is that chance for both of us? Tears began sliding down Claudia's cheeks, but she didn't break eye contact. You don't understand what you're giving up. You could marry anyone. Young patrician beauties, foreign princesses, women trained from birth to be imperial wives. Why choose someone like me? Because they would marry the emperor. You might choose to marry Servus. He squeezed her hands gently. Because they would perform the role of empress. You might actually become one. Because they would see the purple and the power. You see the man underneath who's been starving for authentic connection his entire adult life. And what if I'm terrible at it? What if I embarrass you, make political mistakes, prove that love isn't enough to bridge the gap between who I am and who an empress needs to be? Then we'll face those challenges together instead of me facing them alone while slowly dying of isolation. Servus's voice grew fierce with conviction. Claudia, I've been an adequate emperor for 20 years by sacrificing everything personal for duty. But I want to be a great emperor. And great leaders understand joy, compassion, and genuine human connection. You could teach me those things. She was quiet for a long moment, studying their joined hands as if they held answers to impossible questions. The woman who knocked on your door 3 nights ago, she was just trying to survive a storm and start over after losing everything she loved. She never dreamed of anything like this. And the man who answered that door was just trying to survive the storm of his own loneliness. Neither of us planned this, but maybe that's what makes it real instead of political theater. Claudia looked up at him then, and in her eyes he saw the moment of decision, not just about his proposal, but about whether she was brave enough to believe that love could coexist with duty, that 2 wounded people might heal each other instead of simply sharing their scars. If I said yes, she said carefully, what would happen? How would you announce it? What would you tell the Senate? Hope flared in Servus's chest like a flame catching kindling. I would tell them that their emperor has chosen his empress, a woman of wisdom, compassion, and strength who will help me serve Rome more effectively than I ever could alone. I would tell them that love makes leaders stronger, not weaker, and when they object, when they demand explanations about my lack of political connections or royal bloodline, I would remind them that Rome was built by people who earned their positions through character rather than inheritance, that our greatest emperors were often those who understood the lives of ordinary citizens because they had been ordinary citizens themselves. A small smile played at the corners of Claudia's mouth. You've thought about this? I've thought about little else since you discovered my identity. Claudia, I know this is terrifying and complicated and probably insane, but it's also the first genuinely hopeful thing I've contemplated in 20 years. She stood then, pulling him to his feet with her, and for a moment they simply stood, facing each other in the lamplight, 2 people who had found unexpected love in the midst of impossible circumstances. I need you to promise me something, she said finally. Anything. Promise me that if I do this, if I agree to become your empress, you won't try to change me into what you think an imperial wife should be. Promise me that you'll let me remain myself, even when it's inconvenient or politically uncomfortable. I promise. Your authenticity is exactly what drew me to you. I won't let imperial protocol destroy what makes you extraordinary. Claudia took a deep breath, and Servus held his own, knowing that her next words would determine not just their personal future, but the kind of man and emperor he would become. Then yes, she said quietly. Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I'll try to be your empress. And yes, I'll love you despite all the impossible complications that come with loving the most powerful man in the world. The relief and joy that flooded through Servus was so intense, it left him dizzy. Without thinking, he swept Claudia into his arms, spinning her around the small room while she laughed. The first genuine laughter he had heard from her since the morning of discovery. 6 months later, Emperor Servus stood in the same garden pavilion where he had first shared breakfast with Claudia. But everything had changed. The marble bust of Marcus Aurelius still presided over his private study, but now it seemed to smile with approval rather than judgment. The philosophical emperor had written extensively about duty, but he had also understood love, something Servus was finally learning himself. The wedding had taken place 3 months prior, a ceremony that managed to be both magnificently imperial and surprisingly intimate. Senator Marcus had indeed objected loudly and repeatedly, but his protests had fallen on deaf ears as other senators witnessed something they had never seen before. An emperor who radiated genuine contentment rather than dutiful endurance. Claudia had insisted on writing her own wedding vows, shocking the court with their simplicity and honesty. Instead of the traditional promises of political alliance and dynastic service, she had pledged to help Servus remember his humanity while he helped her find courage for responsibilities she had never imagined accepting. The transformation in both of them had been remarkable. Servus approached his imperial duties with renewed energy, his decisions informed by Claudia's insights about the lives of ordinary Romans. She had begun accompanying him to audiences with provincial governors, asking practical questions about grain distribution and tax collection that often revealed problems his more formal advisors missed. The morning reports, "Caesar," Helena announced, approaching the pavilion with her usual efficiency. But her weathered face bore a smile these days, the satisfaction of someone who had watched a beloved charge finally find happiness. "Any crises requiring immediate attention?" Servus asked, though his tone suggested he hoped for a quiet morning, the usual border disputes and trade negotiations. "Nothing that can't wait until after you've had breakfast with your wife." Helena's emphasis on the last words carried obvious pleasure. Even after 6 months, she seemed delighted by the transformation in palace dynamics. Claudia appeared at the garden entrance, and Servus felt his heart lift as it did every morning when he saw her. She had adapted to imperial dress with characteristic practicality, choosing elegant but comfortable fabrics in colors that complemented her natural beauty rather than conforming to court fashion. Her hair was arranged simply, adorned with a thin gold circlet that marked her as empress without overwhelming her essential self. "Good morning, husband," she said, settling beside him at the small table with the ease of established intimacy. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I have in 20 years, he replied truthfully. The nightmares of imperial isolation that had plagued him for decades had gradually faded, replaced by the simple peace of sharing his life with someone who understood both his burdens and his humanity. "The Syrian ambassador's wife sends her regards," Claudia said, selecting fruit from the morning spread. "She's quite impressed with the new grain distribution program." Apparently, her husband mentioned that Rome's attention to provincial welfare has improved markedly in recent months. It was a subtle way of acknowledging something they both understood, that Servus's rule had become more effective, not less, since he had chosen personal happiness alongside imperial duty. The fears of political disaster that had haunted their early days together had proven largely unfounded. A confident, contented emperor served Rome better than a brilliant but emotionally starved one. Senator Marcus still glowers during Senate sessions, Servus observed with mild amusement. "Though I notice he's stopped bringing lists of suitable brides to our meetings. Perhaps he's finally accepted that some battles are worth losing," Claudia replied diplomatically. In truth, Marcus had grudgingly acknowledged that the emperor's marriage had brought stability rather than chaos. The succession question that had dominated political discourse for years had been quietly resolved. Claudia was already showing signs of pregnancy. Though they had agreed to wait another month before making the announcement public, Captain Lucius approached the pavilion with his characteristic measured stride. But his scarred features now bore the relaxed expression of a man whose primary duty, protecting the emperor, had become significantly easier now that Servus was no longer slowly dying of loneliness. "Caesar, forgive the interruption, but there's a delegation from Gaul requesting audience. They specifically asked to meet with both you and the Empress." Servus and Claudia exchanged glances. Joint audiences had become increasingly common as foreign dignitaries recognized that the Empress's insights were valuable rather than merely ceremonial. She had proven particularly effective at understanding the concerns of provincial populations, perhaps because she remembered being one herself. "Schedule them for this afternoon," Servus decided. "What's the nature of their request?" "Trade agreements and tax policy, but they've also brought gifts honoring the Empress's Gallic heritage. Word has spread that Rome now has a ruler who understands provincial perspectives." After Lucius departed, Claudia looked thoughtful. "Sometimes I still can't believe this is my life. 6 months ago, I was a grieving widow seeking shelter from a storm. Now I'm receiving diplomatic delegations and helping govern an empire. Do you regret it? The complexity, the constant attention, the weight of expectations." Claudia considered the question seriously, as she did most things. "I regret that we started with deception, but I don't regret where it led us. I regret that your loneliness lasted 20 years, but I'm grateful it was ending just as mine was beginning." She reached across the table to cover his hand with hers, a gesture that had become their private symbol of connection. "Most of all, I'm grateful that the gods brought us together in time to save each other," looking at his wife, his empress, his partner, his dearest friend. Servus marveled at how completely his world had been transformed by a stranger's desperate knock on his door during a storm. The imperial seal ring no longer felt like a golden shackle, but simply part of who he was, balanced now by the wedding band that marked him as belonging not just to Rome, but to another human being who chose to love him. That evening, as they prepared for sleep in chambers that no longer echoed with the loneliness of one person, but resonated with the quiet contentment of two, Servus realized that he had finally learned the lesson Marcus Aurelius had tried to teach about duty and acceptance. True service to others required understanding one's own humanity first. An emperor who had never experienced love could protect his people, but could never truly understand what made their lives worth protecting. The storm that had brought Claudia to his door had indeed been sent by the gods, not as a test of his devotion to duty, but as an answer to prayers he had been too afraid to speak aloud. Sometimes the greatest act of service was allowing oneself to be saved, so that the salvation could be shared with everyone whose lives depended on your wisdom, your compassion, and your understanding of what it truly meant to be human.